Today we're going to be going over lists in Python. In the last video, we went over building advanced programs, making use of printing statements, prompting users for input, as well as making use of conditions and loops, which you also covered in the last few videos. So to start off, a list is basically a commonly used data type in Python in which you can store data. Specifically, we can store multiple data values inside a single variable. So how a list works in Python is that we can declare a variable, much like how we prompt a user for input, and set that equal to how a list works in Python is that we have brackets, and inside those brackets is the multiple data values that we want to store. So we can store one or more data values, and basically we can store numbers, words, and so on as data values. So in this case, we'll store numbers, so we can have 1, 2, 3 as 3 different data values in this list. And basically how list works is that we have a brackets, and inside the brackets we have these data values that are separated by commas. So we have 1 as one data value, comma, which is going to separate these data values, 2 as another data value separated by comma, and 3 as the last data value that we're storing in this case. So now we can simply just print out the list here in Python. So we can simply just print n, and recall that n equals the list here, and it's simply going to just print out this list. So now if you print it or run it, it's going to print out this list. So brackets 1, 2, 3, and recall that I said before is that we can store numbers, words, as well as data values. So here and basically when we're storing words as data values, we need to make sure that we put quotation marks around these words. So we have hello, we can't just say hello, comma, we have to put hello in the quotation marks, and then we have the comma. So we can't just say world, we have to put this in quotation marks. And we have this, we can have an exclamation mark here. So now if you print out this list, it's going to print out hello world and then the exclamation mark. So now that we know how a list works in Python, we can move on to something called indexing into a list. And what index basically means is that we can access a certain element of this list. So for example, if we want to only access hello, we're going to have something called indexing into a list, which means accessing a certain place or position into a list. So if we want to only access hello, then we'll index into hello. And if you want to only access world, then we'll index into world, and so on. So basically how indexing into a list works is that we have n, which is the list here, and then brackets, and then in these brackets is the number that you want, which is basically representing the index or the certain place in which the data place is at. So if you want to access hello, you would think that we would say 1 in order to access this first element. But when you run it, it's going to print out world. Now we only want to print out hello instead of world, because here hello is the first element. And basically when we're indexing into an element in a list, we always start at 0 in order to access the first element of that list. So if you want to access only hello, we're going to do n brackets 0, because we're going to start off with 0 when indexing into a list. So now if we run it, it's going to print out hello. And that's basically how indexing into a list works. We need to always make sure that we start at 0 and we have basically the list and then brackets, and then the number in this brackets represents the position or the index of that certain data value in the list. So now if you want to access world, we're going to simply just print out n and then 1 in order to access this world. So now if we print it out, then it's going to print out world. So now that we know how lists and indexing into lists works in Python, we'll now make a program in which we can initialize a list. So we're not going to have any data values, but then we're going to prompt the user to type in an integer, and then it's going to add those integers into the list. And afterwards, when it's added all those integers into the list, we're going to calculate the average. So first, we're going to initialize a variable like n, which basically is prompting user for input. And we're going to set that equal initialize it. So we're just going to simply have these brackets. Now we move on to a for loop, because we want to prompt the user to type in input a certain amount of times, in this case 3. So in order to do this, we have a for loop. We called it a for loop. we can iterate some variable a certain amount of times, and we have a for I in a range of, in this case, we'll have 3, which means we'll have 3 data values, and we'll calculate the average of those. And now to move on, we'll prompt the user for input. Now recall how to prompt the user for input is that we simply just declare a variable like number, and then we need to make sure that the user types in the integer. So we'll have int outside the input, and then inside the input of these parentheses is the quotation marks, and inside the quotation marks is basically what it's going to print out for the user to type as they need to type in the integer. So we're going to have number equals int in input getter number for user to make sure that they type in integer. So after they do type in all those 3 numbers, we're going to have a function called append in list. And what append basically does in lists in Python is basically add data values into the list. So basically, if we want to add these numbers to the list, we're going to have a function called append, which means adding those data values into the list. So how appending works is that we have the list name, which means the variable here, which you initialize up here, and then dot, and then simply just type out append, which means add basically into a list. And basically what we want to append or add to this list is the numbers that whatever the user types out. So we can simply just have n, which is the list, dot append, which means whatever is in these parentheses is going to add that to this list right here. So in this case, we're going to append the number, which means whatever the user types 3 times. So now to make sure that this works, we're going to simply just print out this list. So now if you print n, so we have 4, 3, 6. Now it's going to print out the list here, 4, 3, 6. And now if you print out 8, 9, 100, then it's going to print out the list here, 8, 900. Now basically, how average works is that, recall from math, average works is that we need to find the sum of all of these values and divide the sum by the number of values that you're adding. So in this case, we're going to add 900, and whatever the sum is, we're going to divide that by 3, since there are 3 values here. So in order to do this, we're going to first need to find the sum of all of these values. And in Python, we can just simply use sum, the sum function, which will find the sum of all these data values. So we can have sum of n. So to test this out, we can prompt the user to input, and we'll type numbers out. So we have 8, 9, 100, and it's going to find the sum of all of these values. And that's basically how it makes Python easier to use, because we have these functions that will make it easier. Instead of having to add all of these values together, we can simply just use sum of all of these data values in this list. So now, for example, if you have 1, 2, and 3, it's going to find the sum of those 3 numbers, 3, 2, 1. So now that we figured out how to find the sum of all these data values, we just need to find the average, which means dividing by the length of the number of data values here. And in order to find the number of data values, we have something called the len function. And len basically means the length. So if you want to find the len of n, it's going to be 3 basically, because it's finding the length of n, which means the number of data values in this list. So we have sum of n, which means finding the sum of all of these data values, and we have len of n, which means the number of data values in this list. And we're basically dividing these together as we want to find out the average. So now if you print out, if you want to have 1, 2, 3 as the 3 numbers, it's going to print out 2.0. And now if we have a number like 100, 116, and 180, then it's going to print out the average of these 3 numbers. So now that we know how list works in Python, we can basically move on to data types in the next video.